So hello, everyone. My name is Lauren McLeod. I'm the Urban Wildlife Coordinator for the Nevada Department of Wildlife. And today we are going to be having a webinar about feeding wildlife, hungry ducktails. So I just want to thank everyone for joining me today. This is day 5 of our Urban Wildlife Week. So all week we've been featuring different urban wildlife related topics. Our last one will be tonight too. So if you're interested in tuning in for that, I'll give some information at the end of this webinar for that one as well. Before we get started, I do just want to go over some webinar basics for those of you that might not be as familiar with how to use Zoom. So just so you know, you can see and hear me, but I can't see or hear you. So we do have 2 functions of communication through this webinar, the question and answer option and a chat option. So with the question and answer, we have a lovely NDOW employee here, Claire Clark, and she's going to be moderating the question and answer. So if you have any questions throughout this webinar, I definitely encourage you to ask them in there, and she'll be able to answer those throughout anything I'm not addressing or you want more information on. And I'll also be asking and reaching out for questions at the very end of this webinar too, so we can get some more of that discussion going. If you have any comments, I encourage you to use the chat. I'll definitely have the chat open throughout this webinar, so I'll try to keep up with anyone that makes comments in there. And I'll also be reaching out to you with questions that I would love for you to answer in the chat box too. That just helps me to feel like I'm not talking to myself for these, so it's super great to hear any participation that you might have throughout this webinar. And just keep in mind too, this webinar is for all ages. So you see this disclaimer on the screen right now. We want to make sure that all remarks abide by that PG rating, and failure to do so will result in participation being revoked or being removed from the live stream here today. So we just want to make sure we're all being nice to each other and we're keeping on topic with some of those comments and questions that we do have. So the topic of this webinar is going to be focusing on some of the effects that occur as a result of feeding wildlife. And let's first start with discussing where it all began. So what is the history of our relationship with wildlife and how does that affect us today? You know, humans have a long history of connecting with wildlife in one way or another. And, you know, we have a history today that is something that, you know, we strive for today, is having that connection to all of our awesome wildlife. And so these are just some examples of some things that I came upon regarding, you know, the history of the domestication and our sort of human connection with wildlife. Something you'll see on the bottom left of the screen, these are Saudi carvings of dogs on leashes, and these date back 8,000 to 9,000 years. So these are possibly the oldest depictions of human-dog interactions ever found. And this suggests that humans were training dogs to assist them with hunting thousands of years earlier than we thought before coming across these carvings. And, you know, it's so interesting to see our want and to connect with wildlife and also utilize them in some of these ways as well. And one of the earliest mentions of feeding wild birds is found in Hindu writings of the Vedic era. And this was at least 3,500 years ago. So these texts describe what's an Orthodox Hindu practice, which essentially stipulates the provision of food, traditionally rice cakes, for birds, but also other animals, dogs, insects, and beings of the invisible worlds. And this is a way of expressing one's responsibility to all beings. Also featured in ancient Egyptian writings were peregrine falcons as a part of a religious ritual and sacrifice. So to meet the demand of falcons required, the royal households would farm fields dedicated to provisioning falcons with food. So this is one of the earliest records of us feeding wildlife in such a way, in such mass production too. And this dated from about 700 BC. It's possibly the earliest form of this mass, well-organized, planned bird feeding. And, you know, even the domestication of dogs, we all have pet dogs. Many of us have pet dogs, and that's something that dates thousands and thousands of years as well. So, this is something that's deep rooted in our culture from a variety of places worldwide, is finding some way of connecting with the wildlife that surrounds us. And so I want to ask y'all a question, is where are we today with our connection to wildlife? So if we want to use the chat, and if you are using the chat, if you have something to say, if you could change the drop down where it says to, instead of writing to all panelists, because that's just Claire and I, if you want to write to everyone, and then we can all see your answers too. But I would love for you to share, what you think our actions as humans, or why, what prompts us to give back in some way. What is our connection to wildlife today, or what do you perceive it today? Or what are some ways that, you feel like you can connect with wildlife? Claire says maybe an appreciation of wildlife moves us to protect it and its spaces. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a way of giving back, right? Luis says, I love talking to them. It's great therapy. Absolutely. I mean, I think many of us can relate to that too if we have pets of any sort. Talking to them, getting that comfort and connection with them. That's a great answer. And as we move on with this webinar too, just think about that question some more. And if you don't want to write it in the chat, that's fine. Just, understand where you are at with your connection to wildlife, or, where we are at as humans with our connection to wildlife too. I think because the history of our connection to wildlife quite possibly dates back to the start of our history. Just as providing food to a visitor in our own homes gives us the opportunity to offer gratitude or hospitality to someone, feeding animals typically stems from that same intention, from a desire to connect in the best form of communication that we know how to. We can't have a conversation back and forth with wildlife, but we can show them our gratitude and appreciation in other ways. And so it's often with the best intentions, be it that gratitude, curiosity, or just plain friendship, that we may wish to offer wildlife something in return, rationalizing that feeding wild animals doesn't really do any harm. But there are, some ways that we're going to go into, and, there are some benefits and some disadvantages to this action as well. And these 4 pictures here, these are just some examples of fostering that connection. We see in the top left, feeling of usefulness or gaining the trust of animals, or, an increased public awareness. So by creating, an opportunity where we can get close to some of this wildlife, we're raising public awareness to ensure that there are people there that will care for this wildlife in some way or another and promote their conservation, or just to observe them and photograph animals. So for entertainment, things like that, just to get to know some of that wild environment that surrounds us in any way or another. And there are 2 kinds of feeding that I'd like to discuss here, and that is the intentional and the unintentional feeding. So when we think of intentional, it's some things that we see here. It's, it can be necessary in captive environments like zoos, where wild animals might depend completely on that human husbandry. So, or wildlife rehabilitation, and that's where we would be intentionally feeding that wildlife. And it also occurs across a spectrum of semi-captive and wild environments that we've witnessed, or maybe even been a part of ourselves. And then there's the unintentional feeding. And this occurs when wild animals are attracted to garbage, compost, landfills, or gardens, fruit trees, the list goes on. All of that obtainable food that is available for wildlife to gain access to. And some of these photos here may look familiar. It might bring you a feeling of frustration if you've had to deal with this in some way or another. Oftentimes unintentional feeding is that kind of feeding that was unexpected, or, might create a nuisance for us in some way or another. And so we're going to focus this first part of the hour just discussing the various impacts that feeding wildlife can have. And this is going to be pertaining to the animals themselves, which we'll start with. And we'll also talk about the impacts that it has on us as humans and to the environment as well. So just to give you a general overview of some of those impacts on animals that feeding wildlife can have, and we'll kind of break these down. So the first is that poor nutrition. So wild animals, they have specialized diets and they can become malnourished. They can even die if fed the wrong foods. And oftentimes animals cannot distinguish food from, say, wrappers or foil, and they can get sick from eating these items. And an unnatural diet, such as, say, bread and commercial poultry feeds, this is something that you see in that right picture. This is something that can cause angel wing in a lot of waterfowl. So this is an irreversible deformity that essentially prevents or limits flight. This can make them more vulnerable to predators. And this is specifically from some of those food sources, like those carbohydrate heavy and protein heavy foods like bread. So it's not only not a part of their specialized diet, but it's something that's creating a disadvantage for their survival as well in some of these ways. And something else to keep in mind too with the poor nutrition is that a lot of animals have specific kinds of digestive bacteria that grows in their stomachs to help them digest some of their specialized diet. This is especially true for the deer you see pictured here. A lot of ungulates have this as well. So bighorn sheep too. Really herbivores in general, any animal that requires those bacteria to digest some of those hard vegetation food sources that they're eating. So, the downside is that different microorganisms are needed to tackle different plant material. So say, a diet of new shoots and other spring growth will lead the deer to have different stomach microbes compared to a diet of bark and woody shrubs that you might be seeing them eat in the winter months when some of those spring shoots aren't as available. And time is needed for these microorganisms to develop in the gut. So it's for this reason that deer can't really switch foods quickly, and why carcasses can often be found having starved to death with full stomachs when they've been fed an unnatural diet. So if we're giving them human handouts of vegetative foods that are more of their spring diet while it's in the winter season, then their microorganisms are kind of just being shocked in a way. And so their digestive system isn't able to digest that same food because it's not something that they've built up that resistance to for that time of year. And, it's all well-meaning from the human side of things of trying to offer this food source to animals that, during a time of year that there might not be as much food available, but it can actually have super harmful effects on some of these animals as well. Something else that can occur is the spread of disease. So many wild animals don't really interact with others of their own species or even species, other species in general, except during, say, mating season and when they're raising their young. And this is a natural way for animals to limit diseases among a wildlife population. So they generally keep their space. And of course, there are differences between species and how they interact with one another. But there are some sort of checks and balances in their natural behavior to encourage, congregating in small portions of time and not in large numbers. And so by gathering these animals together in unnatural groups, these diseases, they can spread much more quickly and can destroy a large number of animals at once. And so oftentimes when we have a food site, so an area where birds or other animals are fed in one location, you are encouraging that congregation of animals, which can lead to that spread of disease. And, there's a list of just examples of some of those diseases that can be spread. When you see here chronic wasting disease, that's spread by exposure to, say, urine or saliva or feces. And all of these, they get mixed together when animals congregate at some of those feeding sites. Canine distemper, this is something that you'll see in a lot of canine species. So coyotes, you'll even see them in foxes, raccoons. And, this is something that can cause distemper in those animals as well. So these are just some that, you want to keep in mind, some of those effects that this will have on the animals from creating an environment that might be unnatural to their normal behavior. A big one too is delayed migration. So we have a lot of birds that migrate through the state of Nevada during our shoulder seasons in the spring and fall. But when they're provided a ready food source, a lot of times it discourages them from wanting to migrate. So if you picture an urban pond, for example, you have a bunch of waterfowl with a ready amount of resources, even a natural form of resources there, natural plant growths there. And then when those winter seasons come, some of that vegetation dies down, so there's not as much plentiful food. And at the same time, some of the temperatures are dropping too. And so these birds are going to migrate where there's a larger food source and a more temperate environment for them. And when we are providing them some of that unnatural food source, birds, any animal, they're not going to want to work hard for food if they don't have to. So if they're finding that, in this urban pond location where normally that time of year, some of that plant growth would go down, but they're being provided food, they're not going to want to migrate because they still have an easy source of food for the time being. And it could be, too late before those temperatures fall enough and they don't have that energy reserve to migrate, that they might struggle to survive as a result of those drop in temperatures. And this can go the other way too. I'm in the Las Vegas location. Our summers get very, very hot. And so if they're staying in those hot summer months, this can have the same effect as well. And injury too. So again, with that congregation of animals, they'll get very competitive with one another. And so that can lead to them getting aggressive with one another. But there's also injury that can occur as a result of a human presence too. So when we have these waterfowl that are congregating at feeding sites, especially at our urban ponds, then they're used to a hand motion that looks kind of like this. So we have these waterfowl making use of a food source, but it looks very similar to casting a line. So if we compare these two, waterfowl don't necessarily know the difference between when someone is casting a line and angling at an urban pond versus someone throwing bread or throwing food to them. And so we oftentimes have these situations where waterfowl will have fishing line caught in their beaks or in their wings because they're going toward what they've associated with a food source. And this can be really dangerous for them. So it's something to keep in mind, especially too when it comes to angling. If any of y'all are fishermen, fisherwomen, I just want to throw this in here. Definitely always try to place your unwanted fishing line in trash cans or any of those monofilament recycling tubes we have a lot of at a lot of urban parks. It's really important. It just keeps some of our animals safe there too, to avoid some of that from happening as well. Another impact that feeding can have is undeveloped foraging skills. And this is particularly seen in very young animals. So if we have young animals that are conditioned to associate humans with food, and especially during that phase where they're starting to get their independence and they're starting to forage on their own, if they're fed handouts, then they're not required to learn some of those natural foraging skills. And this is critical for survival. Then they become fully dependent on humans. And so when that source is removed, they are going to struggle to survive. And, most animals, you want them to, or they do naturally remain vigilant when foraging. So they have a full awareness of their surroundings. This is especially true for ground foragers like doves, quail, rabbits. In a natural environment, they're going to maintain, close to cover. They're going to be near those shrubs where they can find that cover. But typically when humans are feeding animals, this occurs in open areas, whether it's open fields. And this kind of teaches a behavior of the animals to seek those open areas for food. And that creates a situation where they might be much more vulnerable to predation. And altered reproduction rates. And this is an interesting concept to dive into when it comes to some of that unnatural feeding as well. So feeding, we have this abundant food source for these animals. So as a result, one of their reactions is to increase their reproductive success. So they're reproducing more often, maybe in larger litters. And this doesn't sound bad. Let's feed the animals. It'll create more animals. It'll rebound their population. But this can actually have pretty negative effects. And this has to do with a concept called carrying capacity. And so in the wild, the number of animals being born is often directly related to the amount of natural food that's available. So the number of animals surviving will also depend on how much food is available. And this is kind of nature's way of keeping a balance. So when an unnatural food supply becomes available, those animals may be producing more young, and soon there may be more animals living in an area than what the natural food sources can support. And so what we're seeing this too, so if you look at the carrying capacity up here, that's essentially the food source. So down here we have, time equals 0. Let's say a population of a specific species is just starting out in an environment. And so when they're just starting out in that habitat, they're starting to reproduce, and then more of them are reproducing. So we're starting to get this exponential curve. And then when they're reaching close to that carrying capacity, to the amount of food that's available to sustain their population, they start to level out. So they'll start reproducing less frequently, and they'll kind of reach this equilibrium with the amount of food that's available in their environment. And this can be related to multiple kinds of scenarios, but I want you to think about, in our personal lives, let's say you go to the supermarket every week for your grocery shopping, and it's always been super well stocked and quiet and nice. And then suddenly a new housing estate is built nearby. And so this leads to an influx of other people all trying to do their shopping. And so if the supermarket only had a limited amount of food, and when you wanted to go to the store and buy a melon, let's say, and so if they have more shoppers entering this grocery store, then we're going to have more people looking for some of those same food sources. And so if the melons are out at the store, they might order more, but it's going to take a couple of days for them to arrive. Just like wild food takes a little bit of time before it can fully replenish again. So you need to get one of these melons, but everyone else in the shop happens to want to have a fruit salad that day. And so they're all looking for melons too. So what do you do as a result? Maybe you try to get the fruit first. So maybe you get to the shop super early, or barge your way through, knocking other shoppers out of the way as you try to find the last of the food source. And this is something that's known as competition. It's something that happens throughout all of our wildlife interactions. And it's essentially, you and your neighbors are striving for the same thing. And invariably, some will succeed and others at the expense of those others. And this is kind of the same as what happens in some of those populations when the carrying capacity is thrown off in a population dynamic. So we have this same carrying capacity here. We have, this is just an example of an unrestricted deer population. And as a deer's population reaches that carrying capacity, they may have an unnatural food source that allows them to go beyond that carrying capacity. And now we have too many deer. And so we have deer that are abruptly over the carrying capacity. There's not enough food to sustain that population in a natural environment. And not only that, we're now seeing the effects of too many deer in one location, which can lead to habitat destruction. Some of that vegetation might not be able to grow back as quickly. And so then we're seeing a decrease in that carrying capacity, so a decrease in that food source. So we're going to see dramatic drops in the population size until it's able to level out again. And so this can have, even though at the start of an unnatural food source, it might be an okay thing for the population, it does have devastating long-term effects in the long run. So, essentially, to summarize, more animals equals more competition, and that resulting habitat damage from that competition occurring will reduce that overall carrying capacity. And thinking about unwanted attention too. So, all of us want to see certain wildlife maybe in our backyards, and then don't want to see other wildlife. But, it's almost impossible to put out food so that only one species can access it. And I'm sure, we've witnessed this before. Thinking about, if you hang up a bird feeder in your garden and you get the birds you want, and then you might get some of those birds that you perhaps don't, like feral pigeons, for example. And, at the same time, some of that bird food falling to the ground may attract rodents, which many people usually don't want to encourage in their yards. So we can get some unwanted attention from maybe some of that wildlife we don't want to see as a result too. And this applies for feeding sites for feral cats or other animals as well. We're creating a food source for an abundance of animals in one location, but we're also creating, as a result, essentially a buffet for predators. So now we have all of these animals in one location, and say predatory animals might draw themselves to that area because now all of their food is in one location too. And so we might get more frequent visitors by predators as a result as well. And on this topic too, I do just want to include that our little cats, which we adore so much, are very vicious predators themselves sometimes. So especially during the spring season, let's try to keep our domestic cats inside, and it keeps them safe from some of that predatory behavior, but it also keeps our wildlife, like our birds, safe as well. All right, so I would like to go into the impacts on humans as well. And I do know that we've been talking about, a lot of the negative stuff as it results to feeding wildlife, but this definitely isn't going to be all that we talk about. I do want to go into, some of those other aspects of it as well and some of our connection with it. But some of those impacts that feeding can have on humans themselves are listed here. And again, we're going to go through some of these as well. One is altered behavior. So this can be aggression toward humans. This is especially seen when we're viewing intentional feeding by humans. So, we see some of these photos up here. There's a bear at a picnic table just waiting for a food source. There's food-seeking squirrels. And in fact, if you see the photo right here too, this is a photo that was taken of a visitor's hand that was visiting Zion National Park that was feeding a squirrel. They get aggressive. They start to associate our hands with food, and this applies to any animal. Essentially, they don't know where our hands end and the food begins, vice versa. So when they start to see that humans are their food source, they're going to act aggressively for that food source, for that survival. And, this risks injury to us. So when we don't keep that respectful distance from wild animals, we have the potential of that sort of situation occurring. And, wildlife, they misinterpret our actions too. Again, they're just associating our hands with that food source. So it can lead to animals getting super aggressive toward humans, which of course we never want that to happen. And especially when it comes to large animals too, like bears or coyotes, when they start to associate humans for food, it not only becomes a threat to our public safety, when they're scouring our campsites or dumpsters for more, but some of these animals, and through no fault of their own, they might be deemed a nuisance for their behavior. And when it does become a public safety, things like euthanization or removing them in some other way becomes a reality. And that's not something that we want to see in these animals that, don't understand those consequences the way that we can understand those consequences. And two, I mean, a lot of these animals can transmit diseases like squirrels. And so we don't want to be bit by these animals. That's a threat to our own health as well. And, just keeping in mind from the eyes of an animal, it's hard to tell where the food stops and your fingers begin. And I did want to share, this is a really funny poster that you can see. If you've ever been to Zion National Park, they have this in all of their shuttle buses. It's kind of like an infomercial diet advertisement for squirrels, saying, I lost 3 pounds and I feel great. The squirrel that was being fed that unnatural diet, when resourced back to a natural diet, was able to have that healthy fitness level as a result. Some other things we might see is property damage when we create situations where food is available to animals. And, especially when they start to associate a human location with that food source, if they're used to getting food from a certain location. So animals might chew or bite into packs and coolers, they might enter vehicles. And, as soon as they start to associate some of these structures with food, they're going to learn that practice and continue to do so. So this is when they become food conditioned, essentially. I've personally had this experience before in the backcountry. I decided I was going somewhere in the backcountry, and I used these scent-proof bags, these Ziploc bags that are supposed to hide the scents of food. And normally I carry a bear canister in the backcountry, but I was in an area where there wasn't a population of bears. And so I thought these bags would be fine. And it could be that I didn't seal it all the way. I went hiking for the day and I came back to my campsite, and rodents had gotten into it and completely dispersed the food everywhere. So I lost, I had 3 days left in the backcountry and now had a day and a half's worth of food as a result, because I was irresponsible with my food storage practices while I was out there. And so this can lead, to safety concerns with yourself. You don't want to be hungry in the backcountry. So there are things to keep in mind when it comes to this. And this goes back to the intentional and the unintentional feeding. We may not be intending for animals to get to our food, but we still need to be responsible with some of those practices to ensure they don't, especially in areas where they might have some of that conditioning that's already taking place. And vehicle collisions is definitely a big source of problem for some wildlife in areas like national parks, where we do see a lot of that feeding behavior. If people are feeding food to animals, especially out of their car, those animals, again, it's that association, that food conditioning. They are going to start seeking vehicles out, knowing that one time they got, an apple from the car window, maybe this time will be the same. And that will lead to those vehicle collisions. And so that leads to a public safety concern for ourselves and for those animals as well. And it's also against the law in a lot of areas too. And this doesn't apply to all animals, but there are many laws that prohibit the feeding of animals in one way or another. These are just some of the state laws that you can see here for the state of Nevada. And these are in place, not to be inconvenient, but for some of those reasons that we've listed before. There are these negative impacts to humans and these negative impacts on animals that these laws have been created as a result of. And, these are just some of the city ordinances as well for the Southern Nevada area that also prohibit a lot of the feeding of, say, waterfowl or pigeons or other animals in some of our parks and private spaces as well. So, these are all in place for, those very reasons that we've discussed. And finally, too, the impacts on the environment is something to keep in mind as well. And so we did mention that with any feeding sites, it does lead to that congregation of animals, overcrowding of animals. This is a photo. This is actually taken at a pond in Boulder City. It's ducks are waiting in the parking lot at the pond for their handouts that they receive every day. And so these ducks have been coming to the pond at the same time every day around the dawn hours, because that's when they've been conditioned to be receiving their food. So they've gotten used to them receiving food at a certain time of day. And so they all crowd up in the parking lot as a result. And this can have pretty severe harms on the habitat. So not only, with that aggression that they might have between their own species, but thinking about that trampling of vegetation or overeating of some of those areas, or some of those other animals that are trying to survive in some of those same areas as well. It also leads to poop everywhere, which is, not only gross, but can also have some health consequences on the habitat and ourselves as well from being exposed to some of those things. And, supplemental feeding can also introduce invasive weeds into a habitat too, if unnatural seeds are being provided of any way as well. And Annie has a good question. She says, is it ever helpful to feed wild animals? And we are going to go into that. I know we're starting with a lot of the negative stuff, but we will end on a positive light. And, I'm definitely going to be asking for y'all's input on that as well as we get there in just a few minutes. So just hang tight, Annie. I appreciate you reaching out. So with that overcrowding, with that congregation of wildlife, it has that harm on the habitat, and it can also have some harm on the water quality. So we're gonna bring that bullet point again, too much poop. So this is a big thing among not only waterfowl, but other animals as well. And these photos are from that same pond that you saw those ducks crowding in the parking lot, just illustrating some of those feces that were left throughout the sidewalk in that area, and a result in the water quality as well. So, poor water quality in this sort of situation is usually due to those high amounts of fecal matter and excessive consumption of plants by those birds. So if these birds are eating on all of those plants by the shoreline, you're getting more erosion because those roots of the plants aren't stopping some of that other stuff from getting into the waterways. And so you'll get this muddy, cloudy water. And this can make it difficult for other animals and plants to live in the water. So say fish that rely on clear water to find their food sources are now dealing with water that's full of sediments, and they're not able to survive as well. Or some of the composition of the fecal matter can lead to algal blooms in the water as well. And an ecosystem imbalance. And so we've kind of touched on this in a few ways regarding some of those impacts that it has. There's impacts on other animals and other plants. And these are just, some commonly fed animals that we have in the state of Nevada. You see some burros there on the left, and a congregation of carp there on the right. And, any invasive species, these are invasive, borderline invasive species. They can outcompete some of those native species that rely on those same resources, but no longer have, the masses to compensate for all of these invasive species that are now pretty much taking advantage of those food sources that those same native ones rely on. And so burrows, they'll overbrowse the vegetation, and especially near springs too. And so now we're dealing with their fecal matter near our waterways. And this can have a negative impact on the spring ecosystems. And especially since some of these plant species only exist in some of these small fragile habitats as well. And then common carp that we see on the right there, they will degrade the water quality. They can destroy habitat for waterfowl, for other fish, for amphibians. So, and this kind of has to do with some of their feeding habits too. While they search for food, oftentimes carp will burrow into lake sediments. And so in the process, they're uprooting some of that aquatic vegetation. They're increasing the water turbidity, and they're releasing large quantities of sediment-bound nutrients. So this can stimulate algal blooms in some of our waterways. And again, just their mass numbers alone are enough to sustain, there's enough food, or there's that carrying capacity to sustain a certain number of animals. And if they are the majority of those animals, then they're outcompeting those food sources for some of those other animals as well. And, we did touch on the delayed migration, that some of those unnatural food sources, what that can do for the birds themselves. But this also leads to that ecosystem imbalance too, because when we're seeing the larger picture of how migration has evolved with other plants and animals in an ecosystem, we're seeing something else too. So this photo, we can see this is kind of just a general description of how important the timing of migration can be to the overall ecosystem. So you see in this first lot here, we see a goose that has gotten to its migration site earlier than normal. And so at this point, it's gotten there early in the spring, let's say, when some of these grasses are just beginning to grow that it feeds on. And when it gets there too early, that not only is not a substantial food source, maybe for those population of birds, but now this grass doesn't really have as much of a chance to rejuvenate and stay healthy throughout the season. But then when we see on the latter side of things, when they don't arrive at all, say those birds didn't migrate because they had a food source year round in the one location that they are at, then that allows these plants to become overabundant in that habitat. And, that's great for the specific plant species. But when we think about some of those other plants that might be trying to survive around it, now we have these strong plant sources that might be creating an abundance in one area and not allowing for some of those other native plants to grow as well too. All right, so we went over some of those negative stuffs. So all the negative things that feeding can have on those animals, the negative impacts on humans, but also on the environment. But I would love to hear from y'all. Can we think of instances in which feeding wildlife may have a positive or a neutral effect? So I would love to hear your input if you want to join in on the chat and just share with me some of the ways that you think, what are those situations where we should feed wildlife or where it would have served them and benefit in some way. Perfect. Yeah, Louise says bees, butterflies, hummingbirds. Absolutely. And areas that humans have caused a loss of natural food sources. Yeah. Yeah. If we think about the urbanization of some of our urban areas, that development encroaching on natural habitat, some of these animals might be struggling to find those same food sources. And this goes into, habitat fragmentation, especially for, the bees, the butterflies, the hummingbirds, those migratory animals that might need some of those stopover points. Definitely. Does anyone else want to share? We think of some positive or neutral effects that feeding wildlife might have. All right, we're going to start with probably the most common form of feeding wildlife, right? What about our backyard birds? Many people have bird feeders in their yard. I have a bird feeder in my yard. I know at the start of COVID, it was really nice to have that enjoyment of seeing birds in my yard all the time. We're spending more time at home. We want to see some of that wildlife. We get an appreciation for some of these birds. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing to feed some of those backyard birds, as long as we're responsible about it, So we want to make sure that we're properly maintaining those bird feeders. We're cleaning them often. There's a high chance of bird feeders hosting transmissible viruses and bacteria, which can spread disease among bird populations. So that kind of goes back to, again, that overcrowding. The overcrowding of certain species with one another. In a natural environment, they generally do keep space from one another. So they normally have their own space, might come into aggressive contact with others at a common feeder. So this makes it easier for parasites to spread. And so when we're putting bird feeders out in our backyards or in our garden spaces, we just want to make sure that we're cleaning them often, being responsible about it, and if possible, if we have multiple feeders, just trying to give them space between one another. So I don't know if any of y'all have hummingbird feeders, you might have seen this before. they can get pretty aggressive with one another, and other bird species can too. So it's really good if we can to try to keep them spaced apart, to give them a little bit more of that space, and also again limiting some of that spread of disease that might occur as well. And naturescaping is a really cool concept to consider too. As we mentioned up in the chat regarding some of those positives that feeding wildlife might have, is that, we have done our number as humans on the natural environment. We've done quite a bit of modification. We have our natural landscape, and then we have some of our common urban landscapes throughout the state. And this does create a fragmentation of areas where those animals can access food. So naturescaping is a great way to provide animals with that natural source of food and shelter. And so this means that having a yard with some of that native plant habitat, making sure that you're only using native plants. So then if you are attracting wildlife to your yards in any way, they are having some of that normal seasonal diet that they're supposed to have for that certain time of year. And it also allows you to enjoy that wildlife on your property, but at a safe distance for both you and for those animals. And keep in mind too with this that, it's not non-discriminatory. If you are providing a food source in any way for animals, you might not be able to pick and choose the kind of animals you attract. So just keep that in mind too. If you are intimidated by having certain animals in that same habitat, it's something to consider when we are adding some of this natural landscape to our yards as well. And there's a lot of other ways to enjoy wildlife too. And I'm sure some of us, if you even want to share them in the chat too, there's plenty of other ways that we can enjoy wildlife that doesn't include those human handouts. We want our birds, we want our animals, we want them to be healthy and have that natural diet. It keeps them safe, it keeps us safe, it keeps our environment safe. And so there are other ways that we can still see and enjoy this wildlife in our everyday lives as well. And, first and foremost, just getting out into nature, go outside, go for a hike, look for those early dawn hours, maybe when you can see more of that activity, and you'll really get to see some of that wildlife while still respecting their distance. Binoculars are a great way to get close to them too. So being able to observe them, with a closer perspective of their behavior without stressing them out from getting too close as well. Something that I always carry with me too is field guides. So, especially in new environments where you might not be as familiar with some of that animal and plant habitat, field guides are a great way to understand your surroundings and really get to know it too. Because I think, the biggest appreciation and connection that we can have with wildlife is understanding wildlife. And that's how we can treat them better and, make sure that they are staying in those natural environments, and we can really gain the most appreciation from them just by understanding them some more. I would say too, just embracing that quietness, get out from the bustle of the city and, maybe some of that unnatural noise that you often encounter throughout the day, and getting out into nature, enjoying wildlife by, listening not to those unnatural sounds, but maybe the sounds of the bird calls and other things in nature that you might be able to appreciate. And respect them with distance. And so I thought this was a funny thing that had come out as we were getting to know what social distancing is, just showing that animals also appreciate their social distancing as well. And so just keeping that in mind when you do see wildlife is that we do want to allow them to, go about in nature in that sort of stress-free environment. And at this point, I would love to open it up to any questions that y'all have. I know Claire's done an awesome job in the Q&A answering some of those questions. And if there are any that are unanswered, I would love to get input from you. If y'all have questions, you can pop them in that Q&A. You can also pop them in the chat too, if you prefer. And before we do get into questions too, I just changed the slide here to show you that we have one more webinar tonight at 6 p.m. for the last of our Urban Wildlife Week. And it is on leave no trace as it pertains to our urban environment and urban wildlife that we have here. So I definitely encourage you to hop in on that one and get to know Leave No Trace from a little bit of a different perspective too. And so I will open up the Q&A too to see if there's anything in there. It doesn't look like there's any open questions, but I would love if y'all want to pop in the chat too. Feel free to share any questions you have. I'd love to hear them. And if you don't have any questions now, if you think of some later, I do have my contact information on the slide, so I definitely encourage you to reach out to me. You know, if you want to pick my brain about some aspects of feeding wildlife or just wildlife in general, I love to hear from y'all. So definitely feel free to save that. And if you do have questions later, I'd love to hear them. And I do want to say, if some of you are popping off, just thank you so much for joining too. It was awesome to see y'all again on the virtual side of things.